Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Picture it, a really high-level government official, sensitive cabinet meeting happening.
Yeah.
And instead of, full focus, they're on their phone,
Yeah.
tapping away on a messaging app, but not like an official one.
Right. Not something standard.
And there's actually a photo. It caught former National Security Advisor Mike Waltz using Signal, the encrypted app, mid-meeting.
That photo, it's kind of the image that kicked everything off, didn't it?
It really did. It sparked so many questions. And it's really the launch pad for what the media started calling Signalgate.
And what's wild is where this leads, this deep dive. It isn't just about one guy using an app.
No.
It's about how Signal was apparently used by several top Trump administration officials, how their private chats suddenly became very public, and then all the fallout. The security mess, the political ripples. We've looked at a bunch of sources to try and piece together what actually went down.
Exactly. So if you've been trying to get your head around Signalgate, this is the place we're aiming to cut through all the noise.
Yeah, focus on the really surprising bits, the important stuff.
What you really need to know.
Okay, so let's set the scene. This wasn't just Waltz, right?
No, and apparently not.
Sources suggest Waltz, plus people like VP Vance, Secretary Hegseth, Secretary Rubio, DNI Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence.
Cop brass.
Right. They were supposedly using Signal for government communications and not just like casual planning.
No, sensitive topics.
Yeah.
Like the Yemen airstrikes planned back in March 2025. That was apparently discussed on Signal.
Which leads to the first big contradiction.
Yeah, this bit's confusing.
You had a White House spokeswoman saying, oh yeah, Signal's approved. It's on government phones.
Okay. Sounds official.
But then there's this Pentagon memo that very clearly states Signal is not approved for non-public unclassified information.
Whoa. So, complete opposite messages there.
A major disconnect. How can the White House and the Pentagon be on such different pages about an app's status?
It makes you wonder about the policy, doesn't it? Or the lack of one.
Exactly. And reports also suggest Waltz's team used Signal all the time for coordinating work on Ukraine, China, Gaza, lots of global issues.
Implying pretty widespread use for stuff that, while maybe not top secret classified, definitely wasn't meant for public eyes.
Right. Using an app that at least one key department, the Pentagon, explicitly said not to use for that kind of sensitive detail.
Okay, so they're using this app maybe against official guidance.
Yeah.
And then things get really weird.
Yeah, enter Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic.
Right. How does he fit in?
Somehow he gets added to one of these Signal chats, the one discussing the Yemen strike plans.
Wait, added by who?
By Mike Waltz.
The National Security Advisor added a prominent journalist to a chat about pending military action.
That's what the sources indicate. Now, Waltz's initial story was a bit murky.
How so?
He seemed to suggest he wasn't sure how it happened. Maybe a tech glitch. Or maybe Goldberg added himself somehow.
Goldberg fitted himself to a private Signal group. How would that even work?
Exactly. Goldberg's version is much simpler. He said he just accepted a message request from Waltz.
Okay, that sounds more plausible. Just click accept.
Right. A classic, he said. But it gets even stranger because Waltz apparently really disliked Goldberg.
Yeah.
Yeah, used some pretty harsh language, called him bottom scum of journalists, said he had a horrible reputation, stuff like that.
So he adds someone he supposedly despises to a sensitive chat. It doesn't quite add up.
It's a bizarre situation. High-level government talks mixed with personal animosity all playing out on this app.
And the result of this accidental guest?
Well, Goldberg did what a journalist does. He reported on what he saw in the chat.
In the Atlantic.
Yep. So these internal discussions, plans for a military strike, suddenly they're public knowledge.
Wow. Okay, that immediately screams operational security nightmare, OPSEC failure 101.
Absolutely.
Ugh.
Using a commercial messaging app, even an encrypted one like Signal, for sensitive government intel, that's a huge red flag.
Well, I mean, it's encrypted, right?
It is, but commercial apps operate differently than secure government systems. There are worries about where the data is stored, who technically could access it, legal frameworks are different.
And metadata.
That's a big one. Even if the message content is encrypted, the metadata, who's talking to whom, when, how often that information alone can be incredibly valuable to foreign intelligence services.
Like Russia or China.
Representative Bacon, who's a former Air Force general, explicitly warned about that. Russia and China potentially monitoring these chats. He was very blunt.
What did he say?
He said classified information was put onto an unclassified device. That's a serious allegation. A major protocol breach, if true.
And wasn't there something about the specific version of Signal Waltz might have been using?
Yes, another layer here. Reports mentioned an unofficial TM SGNL PNN version.
Look at that.
The suggestion was it might be a modified version, possibly lacking the full end-to-end encryption signal is known for, maybe designed for archiving messages.
Which would kind of defeat the purpose of using an encrypted app for security, wouldn't it?
Completely. If it's logging or storing things less securely, it undermines the whole premise.
And this wasn't the only potential security lapse reported, was it?
No, unfortunately. Other reports surfaced around the same time. Things like private contact details, even some passwords of officials being found exposed online.
Really? How?
The sources don't always specify the exact mechanism, but it points to broader digital hygiene issues. Waltz also had a public Venmo account for a while.
Venmo, like for paying friends back for pizza.
Yeah. And apparently his public transaction history showed connections to lots of other government officials before he made it private.
Okay, that's not great optics.
And then there were reports about using personal Gmail for government work, too.
Oh, taken together. It paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. It suggests a pattern of, let's say, potentially relaxed attitudes towards digital security practices in some circles.
You can see why people in the military would be worried.
Definitely. Sources said military personnel were concerned about these practices and, maybe more importantly, a perceived lack of accountability.
And what about allies? Did other countries react?
They did. Reports suggest officials in Europe, and particularly Israel, were quite concerned.
Why Israel specifically?
Probably because of the intelligence sharing relationships. They reportedly called the leaks reckless, worried about sensitive intel they might have shared being exposed.
Okay, so the fallout is spreading internationally. How did the White House handle this mounting crisis?
Well, publicly, President Trump initially seemed supportive of Waltz, said he'd learned a lesson.
Kind of downplaying it.
That was the public message. But behind the scenes, things were moving. The White House mentioned Elon Musk had offered to help investigate how Goldberg got into the chat.
Elon Musk, that's unexpected.
It is. And arguably, it sidesteps the main issue, right? Which is why these chats were happening on Signal in the first place.
Good point. It focuses on the leak, not the underlying practice.
Yeah.
So, was there an official investigation?
Yes. An internal probe into the unauthorized disclosures was launched, reportedly requested by Secretary Hegseth's chief of staff.
Hegseth, the defense secretary. Okay. Did that lead anywhere?
It seems so. 2 Pentagon officials, names were Selnick and Caldwell, were put on administrative leave as part of that probe.
So, some consequences there.
And the Department of Defense's own watchdog, the acting inspector general, started a separate investigation specifically into Secretary Hegseth's use of Signal.
So, multiple investigations kicking off. What about Congress?
Well, Democrats pushed for a big, broad congressional investigation into the whole Signalgate mess.
Makes sense.
But Republicans blocked those efforts. So no wide-ranging congressional inquiry happened.
Interesting. And there was a lawsuit involved, too.
Yeah, a lawsuit related to the Signal chats popped up. And kind of weirdly, it got assigned to a judge who was already handling a very controversial deportation case.
Why is that significant?
It just raised some eyebrows, questions about optics and transparency, especially since the administration kept insisting no classified info was actually compromised in the chats.
Okay, so investigations, legal maneuvering, but the big hammer fell eventually, right? Personnel changes.
Yeah. This is where it gets really significant. Mike Waltz was removed as National Security Advisor May 1st, 2025.
Gone. Just like that.
And his deputy, Alex Wong, was out too.
Wow. But then, didn't Trump nominate Waltz for something else almost immediately?
That's the really surprising twist. Despite being fired over this massive security issue, Trump announced he intended to nominate Waltz to be the next UN ambassador.
UN ambassador?
Yeah.
After being fired as NSA. How do you interpret that?
Well, opinions differ, right? Some see it as a fail upwards, moving him to a high-profile but perhaps less operationally sensitive role on the world stage, less day-to-day security scrutiny, or maybe a major demotion, moving him out of the core national security decision-making circle. It's ambiguous.
Definitely raises questions about accountability, doesn't it?
It does. And then there was another surprise appointment.
Right, the NSA replacement.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio was named the interim national security advisor, while still being Secretary of State.
Holding both jobs. Has that ever happened before?
Not since Henry Kissinger back in the 70s. It's extremely unusual.
Did Rubio know this was coming?
Apparently not. Reports said even his own spokesperson was surprised by the announcement.
This whole thing sounds chaotic.
It certainly seemed that way from the outside. And Waltz's removal, it was seen as the first really big shakeup of Trump's second term.
Fueling speculation.
Yeah, about a possible wider purge, as some called it. Getting rid of staff, maybe not seen as 100% loyal or aligned.
And was the Signal incident the only reason Waltz was out, or was there more to it?
Sources suggest the Signalgate thing was probably the final straw, but reports also indicated Waltz might have already been on, let's say, thin ice.
Why?
Apparently, due to his general attitude, maybe rubbing some people the wrong way, and perhaps a perception he wasn't fully on board with the core Magie movement ideals.
So the Signal mess provided the justification, maybe?
It certainly provided a very public and justifiable reason. But the Signal story wasn't quite over, was it? There was another chat.
Oh, right, the Hegseth one.
Exactly. A second Signal group, started by Secretary Hegseth, called Defense Team Huddle.
Who was in that one?
Reportedly, his family members and some others, and allegations surfaced that this chat also contained sensitive info, specifically about the timing of military strikes.
His family was in a chat discussing strike timings.
That was the allegation. Pentagon officials strongly denied any classified information was shared, of course.
But Representative Bacon weighed in on this too, didn't he?
He did. He publicly suggested Hegseth should be removed as well because of this second chat.
So the calls for accountability were widening.
But maybe the most, symbolic image of this whole affair.
What's that?
Those photos we mentioned at the start, Mike Waltz, still using Signal, during a cabinet meeting on April 30th.
The day before he was fired.
The very day before. And you could reportedly see the names on his screen: VP Vance, DNI Gabbard, Secretary Rubio.
Wow. So even with the scandal swirling, the behavior continued.
It's a really stark visual, isn't it? It just underlines the ongoing concerns about the app's use right at the top, even as the consequences were unfolding.
So, pulling this all together for you, the listener, what are the absolute key takeaways from this whole Signalgate episode?
I think it boils down to a few core things. First, you have high-ranking officials using communication methods that weren't officially approved for sensitive government business.
Right. Even if not strictly classified, still sensitive.
Second, the almost unbelievable way those private government communications got accidentally leaked to a journalist and then the public. Human error meeting technology.
Third, the very real security risks this created, both perceived and potentially actual risks involving foreign adversaries.
And finally, the political fallout. The investigations, the finger-pointing, and ultimately significant personnel changes right at the top of the administration.
It really makes you step back and think, doesn't it?
It
leaves you with this lingering question.
What does this whole saga really tell us about how communication happens, or maybe doesn't happen securely at the very highest levels of power today?
Yeah. How does all this new tech, combined with just basic human mistakes and layered with intense political pressure, how does that mix impact something as vital as national security, especially in this digital age?
It's definitely something to chew on. It pushes you to think about the systems, the protocols, the safeguards, or maybe the lack of them.
Are they keeping pace with technology?
Yeah.
With how people actually behave?
Exactly. It's that intersection of tech, human factors, and high-stakes politics. So maybe keep an eye on how this develops. What happens with that UN nomination? Will there be more investigations, policy changes? It might be a story that continues to unfold.